Okay, we'll slowly begin the question and answer discussion session. So first maybe we could just ask if there are points of clarification and questions, and then this will also lead to the discussion that we will have. So maybe if you want, I mean, those at the back, if you prefer to come to the front, it might ease the mic process. But if not, of course, you can hide at the back. So, questions, comments, thoughts?
Hey, thanks. That was very interesting, really useful to have such an appreciative and critical, thoughtful comment on Ostrom and her work and the transformative possibilities of it. One of the thoughts I had, so you mentioned the connection with Rojava, and we had this very stimulating presentation earlier this week by folks from Rojava. But one of the things that it seemed to me was still unsettled from that talk was the ecological and economic aspects of it. So as an example of the commons or eco-socialism, that's a bit unclear to me as a connection, particularly because they're still dependent, and for reasons that are, you know, very understandable, on exploiting non-renewable resources, particularly oil. And so I don't quite see the connection there, and I'm not sure. Maybe there's something I'm missing. So yeah.
Thank you, Derek. That was a wonderful talk. Just two quick questions. One, that do you see the Ostrom's rules for governing the commons being applicable to other property forms? And the second question is more of a comment, really, that one of the things that I think is often missing in their work is an appreciation of the intensity of desperation. That you may have the best rules in the world, but if people are literally surviving from day to day and have to just, you know, cut the ground from under their feet, they don't have the luxury of thinking about the next generation, let alone the seventh one. When people plant fast-growing trees because they give returns immediately, rather than say on this campus where trees have been planted by people who have the luxury of thinking about the future. So to the extent that local communities with the, you know, best intentions and will in the world can't actually escape certain situations which make them think in short terms, which are, you know, which have adverse effects on the commons, it takes us right back to, I think, what Pat was saying, that we have to think of the larger structures of structural conditions, the state, the market within which the commons are embedded. So if you can just talk a little bit more about how the Ostroms confronted that question, because I'm sure it came up lots of times in critiques of their work.
Thank you to both of you. It was very interesting discussion. So I have two questions. One has to do, I will do a short comment if possible, okay? One has to do with the question of the state, because especially Derek, you mentioned, and it's obvious in the commons work and also this beyond market and state. But I'm wondering that during the capitalist crisis and during this specific crisis, I have the feeling that we have a phase of empowerment of the state. The state is still very powerful. And we can see that, for example, with the way that it is dealing with the debt crisis within Europe. So I'm wondering how, let's say, the commons approach and the eco-socialist approach deals with this question, with the critique to the state, not only with the new power of the state. And the second question related to the first one, Stavros, last Tuesday, that he also talked a bit about commons. He said something that what is important about the commons is not only the social ownership that Pat mentioned, but also a social ownership of power, if I can use this framework. And this is sometimes we feel, I have the feeling that we're talking about what, we're trying to answer the what questions, and we forget the how question. And this is my question actually. How we're going to have a social responsibility, or let's say a social ownership of power, and how the commons structure or the commons framework deals with this question of power.
We'll have a round of answers or comments back. Derek.
Okay, I'm trying to remember all these. Starting off with Rojava, I think with kind of the Ostrom's work, if you're thinking, how does this fit in with the history of political philosophy, that probably in some ways never works. And though there are problems with how they approached power, one of the things which is good about how they approached power was they wouldn't talk about general debates. They talk about things which are very specific. And I think there's a problem with us as academics, coming up with theory, debating alternatives, but what's the point at which this actually engages with things which are on the ground? So in terms of my political practice in the Green Party, which is slightly separate from my kind of Ostrom practice, as international coordinator of the Green Party, I'm trying to think, what are the most important things going on in terms of green politics? How can we support them as effectively as possible? And I think this is why Rojava is very, very important. I stood as an election candidate in the British election in Windsor, where the Queen lives, got 3% of the vote. And I was sponsored by the People's Democratic Union, who are the main political party in Rojava. You know, and I've had this kind of connection in the Green Party. We sent out an election observer to the election a couple of weeks ago, who was involved, who witnessed the bomb attack, and was, you know, Sean, who's our election observer, was unhurt but saw people killed. And I think one of the things I do get in terms of politics and the Ostroms is what's the specific thing you're going to do in a particular precise context. And I think what's exciting with Rojava is what you've had with the Kurds and their allies, is people saying we were nationalists, now we believe in self-government, we were Marxist-Leninists, now we're adopting the ideas of the green anarchist Murray Bookchin. So on paper, it's kind of ecology, feminism, self-government, secularism, and the practice of that, of course, is going to be very, very difficult, reflects, of course, in some ways the situation with oil, with the Latin American left, that you have people who proclaim eco-socialism, but their economies are based on oil. So we could sort of shout hypocrisy, but what I would shout is David Cameron and George Osborne in my country, who want more and more oil and more fracking and more destruction. So the practices obviously won't live up to ecotopia, but the very fact that you've got a situation where people want to introduce self-government, want to wrestle with problems of conflict and how you deal with diverse communities, who at least aspire to be ecological, that is the core of what the Ostroms were talking about. And these kind of problems of self-governance, and you've got a society where there's been conflicts and sectarianism, and that conflict is going on, and people have been very repressed, and how you actually create self-governing democratic solutions is absolutely at the heart of the Ostroms' work. So that's why it's important, you know. And what I would say is they were coming out of the tradition of kind of city-states, radical republicanism, looking at how that influenced the American Revolution and so on. I think I've forgotten most of the other questions, but what clearly came out with the question about people have to act in the short term, people may be very desperate, they can't think about the next 7 generations. I think this reflects both weaknesses and strengths in what the Ostroms were doing. So what they didn't have was an understanding of class and macrostructures and so on, you know, because their references were coming from Austrians, they were practicing the stuff in the Cold War, they were from a generation The previous generation were people like Buchanan who were disillusioned, Frank Knight, people who were disillusioned Marxists who then became Austrians. So, you know, anything where you're talking about capitalism, class Marxism, those structures, there's obvious reasons why they wouldn't be theorising at that level. And unless we theorise at that level, there are problems because we're not, you know, individually free to get together and do these things. We're within particular structures. I think the closest they came to it was saying, if people have a commons, they then have a material interest in maintaining the commons, because if they don't maintain the commons, they're then in poverty. So that was what they would emphasise. But the nearest, really, they got to kind of conceptualising capitalism was to say, you might have a roving bandit economy. And this would be the idea that, you know, fishing fleet from Japan or wherever would come in, and that way they just suck up all the fish and destroy the commons. So what's good about their politics is it's like this very local, institutional, maybe problems with the local, but very specific. So in what you do in that situation, and in any situation you have to think about rules, but they maybe failed to look at the macro, and I think we can critique them, but equally no thinker does everything. In terms of the financial crisis and the state and all of these kind of things, you know, the state and the market are not kind of separate entities, they work together. The state sets up institutional rules that support the market. Neoliberal economics, you know, failed utterly, and people talked about zombie economics, but rather than having the empowerment, what we've had is more neoliberal economics, because what the neoliberals do is use the crisis to entrench their power. So in Britain, we've got the least resilient economy in Europe based on banking, and that puts it at great risk. But the crisis has increased government debt, so then that's used as an excuse to marketise more and corporatise and so on and so forth. And we have to look at ways to intervene, which I think are very, very difficult in the UK, but certainly what we've seen, and again, probably difficult everywhere, but what you have in Turkey is the HDP, Syriza in Greece, parties in Spain, to some extent all the interesting things that are happening in Scotland. So you have some potential for change, but one of the elements of that is to look in a very nitty-gritty way at how institutions work. So I think one way we can scale up the Austrian, yes, it was the application of the design rules. So kind of yes and no. So there were, I think, 8 design rules that make a good common, so it's like boundaries and graduated sanctions and so on. I don't think you can just take those and then use them to say how other institutions would work. I think what Ostrom was very much about doing was do case studies, see what works, see what fails, and then apply ever more sophisticated and empirical and methodological approaches. So one of the things she was interested in was workers' co-ops. So an Ostrom approach would be to say sometimes co-ops work, sometimes they don't work, and there are wider structural things that might affect this, but just within the interactions of people in the cooperatives. So what would you do if you have like workers' control of factories, like Gramsci would talk about, is you'd say, what are the examples of this? Where's it worked best? Where's it failed? And then you generate rules from that. So what you need is the micro and the macro. So you need to have this like structural critique of capitalism, and you need, in a sense, the kind of Leninist moment of how we change it. But if you're trying to change it, once you've kind of got the Rojava situation, and you've had the revolution, how do you actually run institutions which are people-centred and ecological? And that's where I think her work comes in. I hope that's answered some of the questions.
Just one point on the social ownership of power. It does seem to me that, in a sense, three things matter. One is the people who make the decisions in relation to the use of power have to include all those who are going to be affected by it. Secondly, they need to be able to participate in a way that is meaningful, so that they actually understand what the issues are. And lastly, that the absence of real power, so let's say participation in the form of consultation, which then makes no difference, is disempowering and in fact creates apathy and disillusionment. And one of the reasons why in many countries with parliamentary democracies the participation rate in voting is falling is because people feel, well, it doesn't seem to make any difference at the moment. What's the point? So it's got to, I think, have all three of those. People have got to participate, they've got to be able to participate effectively, and it's got to make a difference.
Well, this will be an easy question because it will immediately follow what you last said, being able to participate. So maybe we can discuss what makes people able to participate. Maybe economic justice, it obviously empowers people and then makes them able to participate. But also this is something that I learned from Michael Albert, actually. I'm a good follower and a friend of Michael Albert and his participatory economics. Another aspect that makes people able to participate is the way we distribute work. There are work that empowers us, and also there are works which perishes people. And then in some co-ops and or in some social arrangements, though people depart with very good intentions for participatory democracy, participatory decision making, because that distribution of work is not changed, like those who do empowering works do keep on doing their empowering works, and those who are suffering under perishing works keep on doing what they do. They are not able to participate, they are not able to access information, and then hold the situation sort of firebacks, or the experience becomes, experience fails. So maybe we can a bit elaborate on this.
Thanks for the debate. I think all my studies and practices are related to both your talk in terms of theoretical background and also of activism, I will say. And so I have a lot of possible questions, but I want to focus on some of them. The first one is to Derek Wall. Perhaps you can address more if because this debate about eco-socialism, I think, was pioneered by Gortz in the 70s back, and there were a bunch of people, very relevant people, like also Mansholt, that was president of the Commission, the European Commission at that time, that participated in the discussion of political ecology in the 70s, and they were there's a debate that then was published in a French Nouvel Observateur. That was discussion between Gortz, Sigko Mansholt, and other relevant people in that moment in the institution of Europe that were discussing about eco-socialism. I mean, Gortz is very relevant in also in the discussion about self-governing and so on and so forth. And in that moment was very critical also the discussion about the idea of it limits growth for Europe and so on and so forth. So my question is that if you know if that inside the Green Party internationally there is a discussion about why they failed, why they will not be able to become hegemonic, at least, let's say, in leftist party. I don't say in the society as a whole, because at that moment, for example, in Italy, we had also Enrico Berlinguer, that has been the secretary of the biggest communist party ever in Europe, that exactly was challenging the idea of austerity, trying to develop a different kind of austerity discourses that communists should embrace because of the clear emerging of news from the third world and the poverty and the inequality among nations. And so, I mean, there were in Europe an emerging discussion about eco-communism and democratic communism, of course, but they failed. So are you reflecting on that? And this is very clear for us. For example, we are now probably next spring we will have in Sweden a debate about that, why they failed, and if you are not reflecting, if you want to participate in that, will be useful also, not to understand why it didn't emerge and didn't become hegemonic, at least in Communist Party, and Socialist Party, and Green Party, because also there were then the Green Party in Germany was really keen on this kind of argumentation, very radical, contesting the idea of growth as the solution, trying to develop, self-reliance society and so on and so forth. So I think this is very important. Then on in terms of political debate, then on theoretical level, I think what I will add another critiques to look at the importance that is for us the Ostrom work is the fact that basically she was intervening in a debate that became analytically relevant in 1950s with Samuelson's work about the public good. So Samuelson developed the analytics that then was used by Ostrom, like the analytics, the marginal cost was zero for public good and so on and so far. And the debate in USA between economists was very normative. Even if they developed an analytic tool, it was very normative because the debate was around where the state can intervene, and Samuelson would state with the, let's say, a larger intervention of public states. Indeed, one of his first paper about that was the space of the state in the economy. So, I mean, this was a clear normative debate between the people that want to expand market intervention and the people that in economic discipline want to an intervention of the state. And in this, they developed the analytics, the marginal cost equals zero and so on and so forth, but they were defeated. And Ostrom entered in this analytics, but taking this normativity as the central part. So one of these critiques that we have to unpack the normativity that is beyond the analytics of a very good institutional analysis that then Ostrom developed, because otherwise we cannot really understand what was the public debate, the political debate on that. Yeah, also. And then to you, just to, because you closed with this idea of Gramsci and the importance now to try to occupy and also space and discourses that are at different level, but how you are looking at these possibilities, because for example for me the practices are really important, not because they will be adding one to another to scaling up, because at one point if you are really hegemonic you jump at a certain level. So it's not a matter of, different practices that we sum up and so on and so forth. Exactly, for example, we make the example of the hegemony, the ability to take the power without make any revolution for the bourgeoisie in Italy was exactly that one. They were able, through their economic practices and social activities, to convince the Italian society that they were building the best society ever. And they're scaling up, taking the state also. But it was not, a necessity, automatic necessity to take it, And this is what, for example, for me happen nowadays in Barcelona in some way. There are a lot of practices of commoning that in some way at a point in the last election they decide to also to engage with the political at municipal level with the political struggle, right? So I don't think that we should dismiss the practices as it, because the practices exactly create a different kind of common sense that then can be used to jump at different level with different properties.
Yes, thank you, Derek and Pat, for being here and for sharing your thoughts on Ostrom and eco-socialism. I was really happy to have this perspective, because I've always, as a student of Ostrom, was interested in the radicalizing potential of her work, rather than the bashing or the worshipping, which is kind of the two extremes which we find today. A lot of her students basically repeat this kind of design principles analysis over and over and over, and it becomes kind of a this kind of reproduction of knowledge without really questioning the politics of this. And then on the other hand, you have people who say, oh, this is neoliberal, blah, 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 and then they just discard it, you know. George Kafentis, for instance, has the Capitalist and Anti-Capitalist Commons paper, where he says, oh, Ostrom is capitalist commons, it's not worth it. So I thought it was a very interesting analysis, this critical engagement, but so I was wondering, on one hand, have you looked at the political impact of Ostrom's work on the ground? This is just an empirical question that I've had. How has Ostrom impacted actual policy and political decisions? She had a story about how her research in Nepal's irrigation systems was actually central in a debate at the time when the Asian Development Bank was promoting decentralization and the statization of the irrigation communities in Nepal. And basically they wanted to build these cement channels all over Nepal, because they thought these old traditional systems were very inefficient, blah, 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 no? And how her research showed that these old irrigation systems were actually quite effective, no? But that's like a very pointed example. I haven't seen a lot of examples of her work actually influencing these kind of big political decisions. And the other question is, I mean, so on that first question, basically it leads us to reconsider the politics, not the political stakes of the commons as a political project, you know, which I think is the failure of the Ostrom tradition, not looking really at this. Why haven't the commons really expanded over time? Why have they been really diminished over time, despite showing that they are effective at sustainably managing resources, you know? And then the other question is, have you had any engagement with Ostrom scholars from the Ostrom School after your book and your articles, and how have they reacted to your attempts to radicalize Ostrom's work? Because I feel that actually there's a tendency to actually make it more conservative and to capture Ostrom to the right, you know, World Bank using Ostrom to kind of. So I mean, it's also a political battle there. So I was wondering what the reaction was there.
Yeah, just a couple of points. On the first question, how do you enable people to participate? I mean, I completely agree with Albert and Harnell that work and the sort of work people do, as I think I said in my opening remarks, shapes who we are and what we're capable of doing. And the way in which Albert and Harnell deal with this is that they try to construct what they call a balanced job complex, in which they divide work into developmental work and boring work. And they argue that everybody should have a complex which consists of both types of work, and that would enable people to have experience of different sorts of work. And so instead of being confined to the experience of one type of work, now I agree with that. My own way of formulating that is to, I propose that what we need to do is to abolish the social division of labour, not the functional division of labour, but the social division of labour, so that some people spend all their time, all their working lives running things, managing things. The rest of us spend all our time being managed, but some of us actually also do intellectual work, which develops certain capabilities. Others do skilled craft work. Others do, some people spend all their lives digging ditches and doing boring work, which is unproductive. And so what we really need to do is to move towards a situation in which the different types of work are shared between people, rather than people spending all their lives doing one category of work. Now, that doesn't mean to say that there wouldn't be a functional division of labour still. Not everybody can be an expert at everything in each category of work, but they can all do the different categories of work. So I think that's, over a lifetime, a better way of thinking about it than Albert and Harnell, but because there's complex problems of different types of work appear in different proportions in different workplaces, and so how do you sort it out? But nevertheless, we're agreed that the important question is the one you raised, that in order to be able to participate, you have to have had the experience of what you need in order to be able to make an input into that participation effectively. The only other issue then is on the question of why did the earlier attempts at eco-socialism fail, and the issue of jumps and Gramsci. Now, I think that the important thing here is that Gramsci argues that people's experience in daily life and in the institutions through which we live our daily lives shapes the way we think. But he also argues that there are these different, if you like, diverse activities of the sort that have dominated, I think, the workshop. But they can be articulated in different ways in terms of different theoretical and ideological positions. And so I think that what happened, for example, in the UK in the 1970s was that there was a growing discontent at the paternalistic, top-down way in which the state, and particularly the welfare state, operated, with people feeling they wanted more control over what happened to them rather than a paternalistic, top-down provision. So how was that articulated? Could either have been articulated in terms of, so what we need to do is democratize the state, get people to participate more in the state, be involved in the decisions that affect them within the welfare state. One way of articulating it. The other way of articulating it is to say, right, well, let's go marketize, more choice. That will enable people to have control over their lives. And that, of course, was part of the neoliberal, part of what gave an impetus to the neoliberal revolution, which got rid of that welfare state, Keynesian, social democratic sort of settlement that dominated in the post-World War II years. And so I think Gramsci's insight here is extremely important, that things happening on the ground won't just themselves result in a movement in one direction or the other. They have to be articulated in terms of particular values, particular ideologies, and that, if you like, is what Gramsci called the war of position. That argument goes on, that struggle goes on all the time, and when it comes to decisive moments, how that pans out, which as it were side wins, depends on what's been going on beforehand. So I think that the reason why the earlier attempts failed is because the, if you like, common sense of the age hadn't been worked on to move it in that direction. And then when crises developed, what was it called? The intensity of desperation. The person over here referred to, not at an individual survival level, but a societal level, when the society moved into crisis and something had to change. The spade work, if you like, which would have enabled the movement to change it in a progressive, democratizing, radical, democratic direction, hadn't been done. And what happened was that the think tanks of the Austrians and the market-based orientations had carried the day, and so that created the framework within which neoliberalism was able to capture the new common sense of the age.
I'll try and remember things as well as lighthouses and the German Greens. I think on equality, I mean, the Albert and Hannell stuff, I remember getting the book, opening it, thinking, this is going to be fucking brilliant, I'm going to love this, and like hating every word of it, to be honest. And I just found it very formalistic. It seemed to be, we've got a very formal plan, and all this has gone wrong with the state socialism, and we're going to come up with a scheme, and there's a great scheme, and how we divide work and so on. And I just found that it was a level of abstraction and formalism that kind of made me want to run away. And I think if you're dealing with these problems of sharing work and equality and minorities and power, you need a broad structuralist comment and can take from Marx and class analysis, and you need to look at gender and ethnicity and all of those big macro things, and they weren't explicit enough to me in Albert and Hannell's work. And then what you need to do is do the very, very micro Ostrom thing of saying, in this commons, actually people haven't participated, and in this institution, women have been marginalised. And when you try and do something about the marginalisation of women, that then leads to another problem. And I think you need some way of melding a big macro social scientific critique with also looking at institutions on the ground and how they've oppressed and liberated people, and a very sensitive way of learning. So one of the things where I think the Ostroms are quite good, though I've not been to the workshop, what I think they were trying to do at the workshop was have this radical democratic practice and participation and so on. And I think any serious way of dealing with this has to be an ongoing practical experiment. Interesting, if you look at Ostrom's work, there's a lot around minorities and equality. And there's the thing about she was half Jewish and how the children were taught her about being Jewish, and about her consciousness of coming from like a very poor background and being in Beverly Hills School, and then all of her very, very difficult experience as a woman academic being, so the classic thing, this is the woman who's won the Nobel Prize for Economics. She wasn't allowed to do a PhD in economics because she was deemed not to have enough maths. The reason why she didn't have the maths was when she was at high school, it was, you don't need maths. So what's kind of interesting is there's so much of her own personal experience around that kind of stuff. So, I think we've got to kind of deal with these things, but there's a danger of like having a formalistic, overarching approach to it. And also, I think we need to open up economic activity, because economic activity isn't just the commodity form. And that's one of the things with Commons and Wikipedia and so on and so forth. And a good way of thinking about this is if you think of production of encyclopedias, you could sell the Encyclopedia Britannica, or you could have the state coming up with a committee to write encyclopedias. But what about Wikipedia? So there is this kind of strange thing that you've got stuff very rooted in Austrian traditions that is kind of very communist in terms of practice, but it's stuff that evolves. It's not like somebody necessarily designing it. Although again, the Ostroms weren't radically anti-planning and anti-design. They just felt that you needed to have some flexibility with it. Eco-socialism, I think in some ways it's difficult to comment. I mean, this is obviously what I'm obsessed with politically, having been an eco-socialist for decades. How do we intervene and build eco-socialism? But one of the other things I think we get from the Ostroms is there's always a danger of, like Wittgenstein said, causes are superstitions. that we think it's narrative X, but unless we've looked at it in some detail, it may be narrative Y. Certainly, as I said before, that the whole kind of eco-socialist tradition, and Barrow and Gortz and so on, not whole of it, but a lot of it was, the collapse of state socialism, the left being replaced by neoliberalism, and people moving maybe from a socialist position. So it may, it's not necessarily simply we've got eco-socialist politics. That's part of maybe a wider tendency for the left to be in collapsing. Certainly what I would say with Green parties is the German Green Party was the most radical and eco-socialist party and is now very much in the centre of politics on the right. And I think part of that is the institutions in Germany, that what you have is systems of local government where people can participate. And what you had was the radical left in the German Greens had very much come out of the social movements. And you then got to a point where there wasn't a strategy to advance things to the next level. Whereas the Realos, it was very much we can go into local government, national government, and so on. So I think there's that kind of thing that we get from Spinoza, that human beings don't have a kingdom within nature. We don't have absolute agency. We work within particular circumstances. And we work best when we're trying to change things, of look at those kind of circumstances. And generally, I think with the Greens experience, particularly on continental Europe, is you can then go into coalitions in France and Italy and Sweden and so on and so forth. And the danger with that is then that erodes your political radicalism, but then if you don't go into the coalition, maybe it's then difficult to move. I think the situation we now have is new radical parties and social movements, but actually constructing the alternatives is very, very difficult. And one of the things I'd say about the practical commons and cooperatives and workers' control, that we're in a society which is very paternalistic, top-down, very liberal. So the habits and practices of cooperation are ones that we have to renew and learn. They're not things which are automatically there. And the challenge for the left is, as there's a collapse of neoliberal institutions, can we actually come up with alternative institutions? And I don't think you can pose this as just a sort of abstract, formal level. The actual practices are going to be difficult to achieve. In terms of the kind of policy impact, no, I haven't studied that. In terms of how Ostrom's used, and this fits in with the debate around public goods, the way her work has been used, and in some ways this comes from her own spirit, is to say there's people like Samuelson who say there are public goods. These goods, for reasons I don't want to get into, technical free rider stuff, can only be supplied by the state. And then you have Buchanan and the Ostrom saying, well, actually local communities can build a lighthouse. Yeah, community associations. So the way it's then mobilised is to say, you don't actually need the state, you can shrink the state, yeah? And you can see lots of kind of approaches within Ostrom, how it can be articulated to then promote neoliberalism. So you have a critique of the paternalism of the state, and then people like Mrs. Thatcher use that to roll back the state, and then you have this strange thing where you have the Hayekian critique of planning, and then Friedman flips that over and goes, yeah, corporations, centralisation, brilliant. So I think there's attempts to mobilise her work in certain ways. There's certainly strains in her work that goes with that, and there's counter ways of mobilising that. I think broadly she had a tradition, but I think it's very open. And my small experiences, I don't, I do my Green Party stuff, I have a non-academic job, I'm on the fringes of everything. I basically just sit and write my books like a hermit, and it's very rare I do anything like this. But my experiences with Ostrom scholars have been wonderful, that it would be, we might come from a different perspective than you, but there's some things we can agree on. And I think there's very much a kind of pluralistic approach with Ostrom's work, and very much a kind of idea of contention and argument, which I think is good. So I think there are different ways that her work can be mobilised, but all the time it's, on the one hand, from the left, we should think about structures and feminist critique and Marxist critique and so on, and all of that stuff the Ostroms didn't do. But there's also precisely what are we going to do in this context? If you've occupied the factory, how do you work out who does what? How do you make it work? How long are the tea breaks? And the Ostrom technique is to say, there's a set of rules and institutions, let's investigate this, let's look at where it worked, where it failed. And, you know, I think if we're going to make a world that works, we really need that. So my kind of overall passion, when I always say people working academically with the Ostrom stuff, is, yeah, the commons is really important, but look at the academic practice of the Ostroms, you know, radically democratic and cooperative. And how do we actually apply that concretely?
So I have a question for Pat Devine. So first of all, welcome back. When you first came here, I think I was undergrad. Were we undergrad? Yeah. And I always appreciate your talks, so first of all. And the second thing is that while you were speaking, I remembered a piece. Sorry for the name dropping, but I'll try to explain myself. There was a 2006 piece by Mark Purcell, and he talks about the urban democracy and the localist trap. And when you talked about the question of scale and the local scale and privileging the local scale, I immediately remembered this piece by Mark Purcell. And he, in this piece, sorry, I'm not fresh on this piece, so I tried to remember and put some notes. And he says that the local scale is not always key to democracy. And because some decisions go, you know, whenever there is a local participation and whenever there is a necessity to give a decision, some decisions go beyond the limits of the local. And actually, whenever we are thinking about the local, even if we think that it's good because participation is actually coming from these people, even the local is not homogeneous. You know, we are always losing some kind of the internal dynamics, internal power relations or institutional dynamics going on in there. So I wonder what you think about this localist trap. Do you agree or not? And if you agree, actually, in this kind of naming, how will I know when I'm in the localist trap or not, when I'm working? Thank you.
Hi, as I said yesterday, I'm a journalist, and I'm from Bloomington, so I thought maybe I should say a few things. I told him when we were having coffee. I find that Ostrom's work is very much reflective of Bloomington community. There are over 1,100 nonprofit organizations. I am part of Center for Sustainable Living. We have the Eco Report, where I do the live production. We have Trash and Fashion, Discardia, Bicycle Work, Forest Alliance, it goes on and on and on. So this individualism within the collective sort of relates to what you're saying, is ongoing experimentation all the time. The corporations are started and people have all the best intentions. Some of them are, you know, read a lot of theories. Some of them are just hippies, wannabes, activists. Some of them are retired scientists. And there's always a problem at a certain point, and one fails and then another starts. So it's an ongoing experimentation. And so I think very much that her own experiences is part of her work. What I want to ask is another person, I'm thinking that his experiences are affecting his decisions now. So I want to bring the Pope into the discussion. Because one of his mentors was a woman who was very much championing the rights of the prisoners and prisoners' families, and she was a communist. And Pope makes a distinction between, you know, communism and what he's doing, but he also says that, you know, communists stole Jesus's idea, which I don't have a problem with, you know. So now he's one of the most green people and most socialist person. So how do we utilize Pope? And how do you utilize Pope? Okay, thank you.
Hello, thank you very much. One of, let's say, the critiques that eco-socialism makes, and where I think the eco enters in socialism, is the critique of productivism and also of technology, of considering that technology is not non-neutral, and also that it's not enough to change the relations of production. We should change the conditions of production and put all the questions, what to produce, how to produce, for whom, considering the ecological question. And so I would like to hear a bit about this now, because it's not only about self-governing and the radical democracy. We should move beyond the question of Soviets plus electricity. So this critique from eco-socialism, I think it's crucial. And how to think from the here and now, for instance, in the social ecologies we want. For instance, what to think about nuclear energy, GMOs, and so on from an eco-socialist perspective. Another question related with the issue of democracy and the deliberation, etc. Somehow Marx envisioned the end of politics with socialism, the end of political conflicts. And somehow, when I listened about the self-governing in the commons, it comes to me that somehow this is connected with some form of negotiation and consensus politics. So I ask a bit, where is the politics in terms of conflict, of allowing also different types of political organization, for instance, diversity of multi-partidarism, etc., to enter in this eco-socialist ways of multi-democracy, connecting direct democracy with the deliberative representative democracy, etc. And also, for finalizing, just the comments. Within the current crisis of capitalism and the aggressiveness of austerity, I got the feeling that eco-socialism has participated not very much in these debates, that it somehow, the discussion becomes very abstract and positioned in a level that doesn't connect with the day-to-day politics that we are facing now. So what kind of contribution could the eco-socialist project and politics to engage more with the movements, with these local initiatives, articulations that are needed for building the counter-hegemony, etc. So how eco-socialism can be more practical, let's say, because I think other currents, like anarchists, autonomous Marxists, are more connected with this daily politics. And I think it would be interesting also to reflect how can eco-socialism move a bit beyond this macro level of reflection, theorizing, etc., to engage more in the day-to-day politics and change things.
Thanks a lot, Derek and Pat. I mean, for me, it's another pleasure because I really enjoy your writings, Derek, on the green left. But I have kind of a concern on conflating the green movement with eco-socialism a bit too much, which I don't necessarily think that they overlap that much. And in your writings, I see that actually there is. I mean, you tend to just bring them together. I was in this European Green Party's meeting here in Istanbul a couple of months ago, and that was extremely disappointing, I would say, and had nothing to do with eco-socialism by any means. So the question I have for you is so where do you position actually, I mean, following up from Rita's point, the fourth international eco-socialist Lowy and Kovel tradition of eco-socialism, which has a distinct path, I would say, and how do you position like the whole politics that the green left within that? And for Pat, I have this very short question on, since you've mentioned the climate change as an example in terms of with the power debates of Holloway and so on and so forth, I'm reminded of the debates we had in Copenhagen in 2009 with the Climate Justice Action Group, whether to halt and bring the COP15 by blockades and whatever, what Naomi Klein would now call this blockadia and so on and so forth. And there is this big debate whether we should be inside or outside of this process. I mean, there is this deliberative or international negotiation process, but many are actually now arguing that the power doesn't really help us inside or being inside and negotiating and trying to convince people, but power may be actually on the outside of those conference centers by blocking and then halting the whole process and then trying to show that this may be done in a different manner rather than those air-conditioned rooms of conference halls. Thank you.
Okay, huge number of really interesting questions. It's always like when I'm with my wife, it's like, don't get him onto religion, don't mention the Pope, not religion, no. But I'll come back to that, that'll probably take about 10 hours. I just love the Pope so much. In terms of the Green Left, I mean, I basically view things as projects. So how do you promote eco-socialism? That fits in with the practical stuff. So institutionally, I'm in the Green Party. In the Green Party of England and Wales, it's moved a long way to the left, although there are debates around that. Is that really eco-socialism? Is it more the failure of the Labour left? To what extent is this theorised? But clearly, at the moment, maybe temporary, the left are hegemonic. So you have the party which was the most conservative Green Party in Europe is now one of the most left. So the project is, how do we do that within European Green Parties? There's no essentialism. We don't go, Green Parties are essentially this or that. It's how do we build eco-socialism? So I'm international coordinator of the Green Party, and I'm very eager to network and work on that. And certainly sometimes the European Green meetings can be rather formalist. But I would say there's a much more of I think there is a movement within the Greens. So for example, in Greece, the Greens are in Syriza. In Spain, the New Greens have been supporting, the New Left. Best of all, in Turkey, the Green and Left parties joined the HDP. So I'm saying to the Green Party of England and Wales, Turkish and Kurdish citizens can vote. What are we doing to support them? So it's a politics of constant, concrete intervention. In terms of the genealogy and the bestiary of the Green Left, it's been amazing that the Fourth International from Trotsky, who we might associate with very productivist and Leninist and old style, the Fourth International has declared itself eco-socialist, and that is a wonderful thing. And I think in some ways, curiously, I get this from Ostrom, that you have to have, in a sense, a Leninist politics, but also a pluralist politics, that some people will be eco-socialists in the Green Party, some people will do social movement stuff and decry political parties, and there is the kind of, that's licensed by Ostrom stuff powerfully, because you experiment. There isn't one person who has the view that you follow. That was what was wrong with Leninism. And, if you look at the Fourth International, particularly Socialist Resistance in the UK, who are a small group, they've done wonderful things. And we, between the Greens and Socialist Resistance and even more Leninist parties, we've done like a whole workers' climate campaign. The Trade Union Council have adopted 1 million climate jobs. There's been mobilisation around factory workers in the Isle of Wight who were in the making renewable energy wind turbines, and the factory was closed and they occupied. And I write for the Morning Star, which is associated with the Communist Party, and it wasn't the Euro-Communist Party, it was the more Communist Party, but they've been very open to kind of debating green politics. So there are a variety of institutional structures, but it's always, what do we do in this specific moment? What's coming up at the European Green Congress? And what I would say is, we'll go, the German Greens, they failed completely. I was fascinated at the last EGP council. There's 2 European Green Party councils a year. One of the great things was there was a by-election, so we elected somebody from the Greek Greens onto the committee. That was a victory for the left. And then to sit round with people like Michael from the Federation of Young European Greens, and I was surprised to find that in the German Greens, the German Greens, they're so right-wing. There's apparently a left, they organise separate congresses, and I would say probably the most active force, if you actually look at it, for eco-socialism in Europe, is men and women in their 20s and 30s who are German. And, we wouldn't predict that. But I think it's something that we have to make. Making it practical, yeah, I think there was a time when it was an intellectual discourse and we'd read Rudolf Barrow. What we've actually seen is workers and peasants and left governments adopting eco-socialism. And if you want practical eco-socialism, and you read Spanish, Hugo Blanco, people know about Hugo Blanco? So Hugo Blanco was a historic leader of the Fourth International, the only Trotskyist praised by Che Guevara, made a successful revolution in 1961 in Peru to defend peasants. He's, I think, now 80. He publishes Lucha Indigena, and he's an eminently practical eco-socialist. And certainly in his paper Lucha Indigena, Indigenous Struggle, though that's looking at indigenous, and he coming from indigenous, and the indigenous as the backbone of eco-socialism in Latin America, it's engaging with the anti-austerity movements and so on. And he, incidentally, is a great fan of Ostrom. So I think that's a way of making it practical. I'm a parish councillor, lowest level of local government. I'm a parish councillor in Ascot, most conservative party of Britain. But one of the things that we've been doing is saying local pubs are being closed, and there's a piece of legislation where the community can then own the pubs and stop it being closed. And that's something that we've been doing since all the time. There's a danger of saying political movements are essentially this or that or the other. It's like, how do you actually intervene in the concrete? The Pope, of course, I just think is wonderful, mainly because of my interest in religion, and I always think I should repress this. You'll have to cut this from the film. But what I like best about the Pope is the theology, because I'm very religious, and I'm kind of pursuing like a completely materialist and realist, real personal religion based on Spinoza. And, kind of when the Pope goes, God isn't a magician, it's like, yes, the true religion of Spinoza. And, just interesting with the Pope that there's no contradiction between science and nature. But I think probably if I said that I like the Pope most because of his theology, that would be very bad for the Pope. And there are other reasons why we would see the Pope as being a good Spinozaist. But if you're a good Spinozaist, you don't say you're a good Spinozaist, or you get excommunicated even more quickly. And of course, the great revelation was I've got very into Althusser. And of course, when Althusser was talking about Marx, he meant Spinoza, but being in the French Communist Party, he could never actually say Spinoza. So I think, seriously, I think the Pope is interesting. I think what's great, there are certainly some huge areas. We could say the Catholic Church has been a corrupt institution. I think we could condemn anything that the Pope says on sexuality. But in terms of capitalism, ecology, nature, and the idea of actual direct focused interventions, he's got that kind of realist politics that we get via Machiavelli and Spinoza and so on, where you have the most realist practical intervention to promote the common good. And I think, yes, we can connect that with Christianity. One of the things I would say is we can connect it with the Latin American left. So my wife will always say, look at Paulo Freire and the idea that liberation is about dialogue, which fits in with Ostrom. It's never about telling people what to do. Saw a quote from Fidel Castro in the 70s saying, one day there'll be a black American president and a Latin American pope. So, in religious terms, excuse me, I'm quite religious, I know other people wouldn't be. Spinoza would say, how do you decide the orthodoxy of a text? How is a text the true text? How do we interpret the Bible? And basically he would say, you just read it, it's full of contradictions and problems, but what the Bible commands us to is obey God. God wants us to promote mutual love. So if the text has the effect of promoting mutual love, it's then orthodox. So I think with the Pope, obviously some cautions about the origins and some things that we'd be very critical of, but I think in the true religion, his effects are very positive.
Right. Well, in terms of the local scale, of course, I agree that is a serious problem, and we've got this problem in the UK at the moment, say with respect to wind turbines on land. There's a huge campaign against because local people, for some reason or other, don't like them near where they live for the most part. So there's always a problem of how, as it were, local autonomy fits into the wider picture. And how you know whether you're in that situation or not is not an easy question to answer. I think it depends on the local circumstances. I have friends who started out by campaigning against the proposal for a wind turbine, not actually in sight of them, the other side of a hill where they live, but it could be seen from a very famous walk in beautiful countryside. So they object to this on aesthetic grounds. But what's happened is that because they've been so passionate about this, they've looked around for all sorts of arguments against wind power, and have now become, through a process of starting off with this local issue, campaigners against wind power altogether, and adopting all sorts of what, as far as I can see, are completely spurious scientific reasons as to why they won't work. So it's not an easy not an easy question to deal with. I think that the inside-outside question is a very, very interesting one. Jonathan Porritt, who was a very well-known Green campaigner in the UK, for many years worked as an advisor to the petrol companies on the grounds that he thought that they could be greened. He recently resigned on the grounds that he'd come to the conclusion they can't. And there is this more general argument that NGOs become co-opted effectively by being drawn into the decisions. And so again, I think it's very difficult to make a generalization about this. My own experience in trade unionism in the university where I worked was that you really had to have a link between those who were in the inside and those who are campaigning and forming the forces outside. And if that link is severed, then either you get pure oppositionalism, but you don't actually want to be involved in the decisions, you just oppose everything, or you are involved in the decisions but get co-opted. And therefore, unless you're constantly, while in the decision-making process, is under pressure from outside, you've got a problem. But it's not an easy question to answer. I mean, I completely agree on that. The only other thing I'd just like to comment on was the question on democracy and the end of politics and diversity. I mean, I've come to the conclusion that the end of capitalism and eco-socialism doesn't mean the end of politics, because it seems to me there are always going to be different views about the way forward, and it's got to be some sort of political process as to how you resolve those. And that's why I think the sort of deliberative democracy, negotiation, participation in decision making, in the course of which you come to realize the point of view of people who take a different angle. But in the end, you've got to arrive at some workable thing that you're all prepared to go along with. And that, coming back to Derek's comment on Albert and Harnell's book, Participatory Planning, or PARICON. I mean, I don't have quite the vehement dislike of the book that you do. And what I liked about it was the emphasis on participation. But what I disagreed very strongly about their model was two things. First of all, it is, for those of you familiar with it, it is actually a neoclassical general equilibrium model in which the individual is replaced by workers or community councils. And it's a process of aggregating preferences rather than engaging in dialogue, in the course of which the preferences change. And therefore, in that sense, there's no politics in it. And that seems to me to be the problem with it. But that's just, by the by. I mean, we're not talking about that model. But I think that the question of the fact that there won't be an end of politics, there are bound to be continuing differences of view. I think that my own view would be that there need to be multiple political parties which offer different visions of the way forward. And I think this also links up with the issues you raised about productionism, non-neutral technology, and that brings us to, there'll be different views on that. How are they going to be resolved? And on the question, for example, the two questions specific questions you raised, nuclear power and GMOs, well, there are very different views on that. I mean, George Monbiot, who's a significant spokesperson in the green sort of camp, has come out in favour of nuclear power on the grounds that it's such an urgent problem and there isn't time to do anything else. Most, I think, of the green movement wouldn't agree with that. I would be one of them. But, there are people who do take that view. And similarly with GMOs, so these are not easy questions to answer. There's not going to be just a consensus. There's got to be, therefore, what you might call a political process in the course of which these things are thrashed out and decisions are made.
We'll just take a last round of quick questions.
Hi. Could you please expand a little bit more on the eco-socialist principles and how eco-socialism can seize destructive contradiction of human and external natural world, and how eco-socialism would be restoring production relations alternative to current capital-labor relation?
Any other questions?
Hi, thanks. And thanks for a really good discussion. It's hard to, I come from Canada. These discussions in North America aren't as frequent as they are here in Europe, so it's wonderful to have a session just talking about this. And also I'm from Lund University, now I'm based in Sweden, and I do a lot of climate change research. So having been at some of the negotiations, especially last June, I can tell you that the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela is the only member who got up and said, we are eco-socialists. And for those who believe that what is happening there is a deliberative democracy, that's not what is happening in those negotiations. So this is one of the reasons why it is so important for people to be on the street outside the venues, as well as being able to talk about it with their politicians at home, because they will tell you, these are national governments negotiating, and many of them are suffering from state capture. So they need to be reminded who their main shareholders are. So stay engaged with your national governments on this as we go up to Paris, please. So one of the things I wanted to ask you about also in the context of Ostrom, because it is true, you get through some of her work, and if we're really just pulled into the commons discussions, it can be overwhelming looking at some of these branching models. And if you're coming from this in more of an anthropological sense, in many ways, after you sit down and catch your breath from the models, you realize that she is trying, the work that she was doing and her husband was doing in some ways was trying to codify social relations that predate industrialization and the enclosures. So you're finding ways of trying to re-socialize and reintroduce people to the practice of coming up with consensus and coming up with your own institutions and being reinvigorated on that. So I wanted to, one of the things I wanted to just sort of raise and ask about from that context is how you're seeing these prospects for these micro practices, whether it's urban gardening and permaculture and some of these alternative threads, degrowthers, how you see that as an extension of eco-socialism in practice, even if they aren't self-identifying in that context, since it seems to be carrying on some of the practices that seem to be embedded in eco-socialism. And also just looking at it in terms of engaging with the localism, and I do think that was very interesting, but falling into the localist trap is a challenge. So being critical geographers and critical analysts of this, we do look to Bauman and the concerns about where you'd have social critique about xenophobia and the prospects of over-privileging certain aspects of local, especially if you haven't made explicit the power relations that are embedded in some of those local systems that are privileging certain local voices over others. So in terms of how we can confront that challenge of recognizing and elevating the realm of the power relation in the local discourse, so that as we engage with deliberative democracy and more direct democracy, we actually have a fuller engagement of stakeholders, and it isn't just an echo chamber of the same powerful interests kind of leading everybody. In relationship to that, just bringing together the Green Party movements, being in Sweden where let's just say ecological modernization was more of the theoretical framework over eco-socialism. So looking to the element of who you're serving and how you're producing and for whom and why seems to be pretty central if we're going to actually have a real discussion on this. So it'd be great to hear your reflections on that. Thank you.
I've got two questions, and I hope to articulate them better than my last one. My first one is in relation to this whole sort of market, state market, and the commons discourse with is it a tripartite, or is it the commons as a polycentric system of governance resource? Is that supposed to replace the dualistic model? That would be my first question. The second one is, we talk about natural resources a lot of the time, and for me, the main question when we are scaling up is market mechanisms, and especially finance in the sense of money, that does have such an effect on the commons as well. And so how do we go about understanding the market as a commons, or finance in the sense of surplus value over accumulation? And is there any work done on that? Yeah.
Well, that's provoked at least 27 thoughts, and I'll try and remember one or two of them. I'm really glad there was a mention of Venezuela, because what you have is ALBA, which is the solidarity trading bloc between Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, Cuba, and Venezuela is kind of Satan. In Britain, we're very closely aligned with Saudi Arabia, and we praise them as being great for human rights, as they chop people's heads off and say it's wrong for women to drive. And of course, during the Cold War, there was a critique of human rights in the Soviet Union, which is completely correct. But then there's suddenly Venezuela is Satan, and certainly there are problems with Venezuela. But I think you can't just say things are being attacked, therefore that makes them good. And there are some big problems with Venezuela. But certainly, you've had this block of countries, ironically, quite often very based on fossil fuels, who've actually got up and said, we're eco-socialists, let's oppose Reds, let's not commodify nature. And even sometimes there's hypocrisy and failure to do that. That's so much better than the governments who are absolutely wedded to the ecologically wrong. And, a lot of these kind of debates about Holloway and localism, they're in the context of Venezuela and Bolivia and Ecuador and of taking power, and a lot of things can go wrong with that, but there's also, that's created space. So I think that's very much part of eco-socialism. So that was one thought. Canada, I was going to mention Ian Angus, who produces Climate and Capitalism, which is a really great resource, which gets onto a lot of the questions we're asked here about surplus capital and how capitalism works and so on. Is a really strong resource for kind of eco-socialist understanding. I haven't yet said anything about the local, and one of the things I was going to emphasise with Ostrom, though a lot of it was based on the local, yes, it's polycentric. So yes, it's not yes, it is getting rid of the duality of the market and the state. And if you talk to people who are more Marxist like me, or people who are more Austrian, all of the scholars who use Ostrom's work would say there isn't just the market and the state. I mean, she did blatantly write her Nobel lecture as beyond markets and states. And, there's a whole spectrum. So, for example, with property rights, it's not just private property, but usufruct, so people can actually have access to property. And this, I think, gets onto the kind of eco-socialist production question, that eco-socialism and Ostrom rejects the monopoly of the commodity, that if we're just producing things to buy and sell and promoting exchange values, that doesn't work. What we can actually have is to actually have something which is more sustainable, because you give people access to resources without always having to privately own them. So, simple thing, car sharing. George Monbiot, nuclear power. What about free public transport? That's maybe things have become so desperate we need that. So both from Ostrom and eco-socialism is getting beyond the commodity, and it's actually finding ways that we can share resources, because there's a logic with exchange values that you produce more, throw it away, and so on and so forth. Whereas this basic idea that you have a commons in private goods, and you 3D print goods, and you rent more, and some Ostrom people might say you can do that within the market. But that, I think, is a key to ecological production. What we've also had is workers' plans. So workers actually say, famous example being Lucas Aerospace in the UK in the 80s, instead of producing weapons, what can we produce instead? So, I think there's some things which are the same in eco-socialism and kind of Ostrom thought, but how do you have this participation and planning so we get beyond simply the commodity? Localism, I didn't quite get into that and meant to, because though, as I said, a lot of her work was based on the local, she realised you needed to scale up, and she talked about social ecological systems and how like a local commons would then be in a wider geographical and social. So she certainly was aware of this. I think the target of Pat's critique, and I agree with him very much on this, is not so much Ostrom, although we both have criticisms of some of the things that Ostrom did and so on, but really of people like Holloway and maybe Gibson Graham, of saying, you don't need to go through the state. If you go through the state, you're immediately absorbed and co-opted. And actually, there's a great diversity of non-capitalist things happening anyway. And I think what we've learned is you do need to interact with state power, because they set rules. So even on the localism, if you don't want a windmill, you don't get a windmill. If you don't want fracking, you put up with it. So in the UK, very top-down, very paternalistic. So the local is used to impose what the government wants, because it fits in with the corporations. So, and again, get for this from Ostrom, focus on rules and institutions. Rules and institutions, self-governance and participation, but governments at the moment set them. So if you're not intervening and challenging those governments, they're going to keep changing the rules and institutions so that there's less and less democratic participation. And I would say, well, another one of the things which is useful from the Ostroms is they had, with Pat talking about trade unions and UCU and so on, is they talk about institutional analysis and development. So they'd kind of write a chart looking at a particular power structure, who's got power, the moves they could make. So that kind of stuff can be quite good for intervening. I don't know whether I've covered all of the kind of points, but maybe to kind of sum up some of my feelings. All the time I'm kind of trying to say, don't think about this in terms of just broad political theory and panaceas and slogans, but what precisely are we going to do within a particular context in the German Greens or the Fourth International, or with our micro garden that does fit in. And what to me, the great political ecologists were Marx and Ostrom, and what they're both doing is saying human beings are part of nature, like Spinoza said, true religion, like the Pope. And our interaction with the rest of nature is mediated by institutions, and how do we intervene? So it's self-governing, and okay, Ostrom didn't believe in everything being commons, but she certainly believed in broader social ownership. So what Ostrom's saying is, in particular institutions in a precise circumstance, what do we do? How do you get the commons to run? Marx would talk about wider structures. So perhaps an image I would give you, if you know England, there's a commons in Cricklade, which is a town in Wiltshire where I come from, and there's a water meadow, which is very beautiful, very famous for its flowers, and it's been maintained as a commons since the 8th century. And this sums up the Marx and Ostrom perspectives, because what you had in Britain is commons, are quite often owned by church, aristocracy, royal family. So there's a danger in which your commons just would be subsistence for the serfs, and you had a commons that was owned by the people, which gradually then had an overall ownership in a kind of feudal structure. So we always have to question the commons. But also what's great about it is there are all these kind of local officials and practices, and if people are abusing the commons, there's like the court leet, and that's come right from the 9th century. So in a sense, there's a danger of seeing commons as something ancient, or that a commons sometimes is something we just get in cyberspace. Commons, I think, potentially is universal, and you have much wider structures of property ownership, but we have to, look at the science of the structures that may erode and enclose the commons, and the kind of science of how do you manage the commons. But in their pursuit of science, both Ostrom and Marx would try to struggle against things which were elitist. But I think all the time we have to think as precisely and scientifically about what makes these wonderful things work. So maybe they are wonderful. So I'll stop there.
Just like to make one comment on the question about market and state. I think we've talked about the fact that different scales, different levels, if you like, a society-wide institution, you can call it the state if you like, is obviously needed. It sets the rules, as Derek had said. It also is probably the mechanism through which redistribution, where necessary, would take place. So I think we've discussed that. What I think we haven't perhaps discussed enough is the market, because the market, I think, needs to be deconstructed. I mean, there's market exchange, and many models of socialism would describe themselves as market socialist. But there's also the operation of market forces, and the operation of market forces exists when the inputs into the production process, as Marx put it, namely land and labour, have become commodities, or as Polanyi puts it, where the land, labour, and he also says money, have become what he calls fictitious commodities, because they're treated as commodities and bought and sold, and they're the way in which resources are reallocated from one use to another through the operation of market forces in pursuit of profit. Now, I mean, if you want to get rid of capitalism, you have to get rid of the market in land, labour, and money. The question is, do you have to get rid of market exchange as well? Personally, I don't think so, but many people do. I think the problem with market socialists, who don't want to get rid of the market by definition, but they also maintain market forces as the allocating mechanism for the redistribution of resources. Whereas in a participatory planning model, you would have those decisions about how resources are allocated made through a democratic, participatory, deliberative process. But market exchange is something that could well be seen as continuing as a way of facilitating the fact that people aren't going to be involved in a purely subsistence economy. So I just thought it was worth making that clarification. We must be careful when we use the term market to be clear what we're talking about.
Thank you very much, everybody, for a lively discussion. So I think it's now time for lunch, but I want to have Begum maybe announce what's going to happen after. So with Amelie, we just thought maybe we could have the closing together while we have lunch and sit on the grass and have this like closed circle and just discuss a bit and then say the final words and goodbye.